Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Fran Riley, Executive Director of News Leaders Association. I'm really glad you could join us today for today's session, Tackling Misinformation, Lessons from 2020 for 2021, part of an ongoing series of vital panel discussions we're hosting to give journalists at all levels the training, support, and networks to lead and transform diverse, sustainable newsrooms. As with all of our events, you can use the chat function today to ask questions throughout the session. And we'll be recording this so you can rewatch it on newsleaders.org. But before we begin, I'd like to thank and welcome our partner for today's event, the American Press Institute, and introduce Director of Program Operations and Partnerships, Kevin Locher. Kevin, hi.
Hey, yeah, thank you so much. And thanks to everyone who's joining today, coming into the chat right now. I'm looking forward to talking there. Yeah, the American Press Institute's mission is to help news organizations transform for an audience-centered future. We really believe that to thrive as a news organization, to build strong journalism and strong business, you have to have a deep understanding of your audience and start from there in both the journalism and the business models. And we certainly know that with limited resources, anything related to that mission requires a lot of discussion of priorities and processes, what you choose to do, what you choose not to do, what you start to do, and what you stop doing. We're grateful to be here with a group of news leaders today because you deal with those decisions every day and thinking big. And so we're delighted to partner here to just create space for that sort of conversation around one of many topics that news organizations are facing today, which is the issue of misinformation, addressing false information. What do you do? What do you not do? How do you make those decisions? And what can we learn from our experiences last year in news organizations to share with one another to make more informed decisions going forward? So I am happy to be here. I'll be mainly in the chat, and I'm looking forward to passing it along to Andrew Rockway, who has more to say from diving into this deeply last year.
Thanks, Kevin. And again, thank you all for attending. And thanks to our wonderful panel of speakers for making the time to talk about these issues. Given the short time that we have today and the breadth of things that we have to cover, I think we really want to just dive into the conversations. Again, at any time, if you have questions for any of the speakers, drop those in the chat. We will do our best to get to those towards the end of the session. We may not get to every single question, but we will try to get to as many as we can. But with that, I want to introduce our panel and get the conversation started. We have Karen Mahabir from the Associated Press, Shana Black from Black Girl Media in Cleveland, Ohio, Anjanette Delgado of the Detroit Free Press in Detroit, Michigan, and then Nicolás Ríos of Documented in New York City. So just to kick things off for us today, Karen, I'd like to start with you, if I could. Can you give us a sense of what kind of misinformation was most prominent from your vantage point at the national level last year, and how is that different from misinformation in previous years? And then kind of building from that, how did AP's work change, if it did change, to accommodate misinformation last year?
Sure, and thank you for having me on this panel. I really do appreciate it. So let me just start by saying that it was a very intense and challenging year for us at the AP. I think particularly for fact checkers and verification experts, and certainly our misinformation and disinformation reporters. And I would say that for us, perhaps, and I think for most of us in this field, most of our time was taken up with misinformation around the virus, from bogus cures to the idea that the whole pandemic was a hoax, and the US presidential election, and all the many, many claims that we saw around voting and fraud. And so I would say that we were sort of constantly pivoting between those two big areas, as well as focusing attention on misinformation around the State House protests over lockdown measures and the BLM movement. We also dealt a lot with conspiracy theories like QAnon, as well as extremist groups and how that sort of intersected with our work. And I would say that it was a really different year for us in so many ways. I think before 2020, a lot of the misinformation that we were seeing was general political misinformation or misinformation around major breaking news events, particularly shootings or mass shootings, which of course went down in 2020. We had also seen a lot of immigration around, or sorry, a lot of misinformation around immigration. That was a really big topic for us before 2020 and is starting to come back. Other things that we kind of experienced that were new for us in 2020 were the actions that some of the platforms were taking against misinformation. So becoming much more aggressive and proactive about pointing people to accurate sources of information. That was a new thing for us, and it was definitely interesting to see, and we tracked it really closely. But I think the biggest change for us in the way that we approached misinformation is that we suddenly found ourselves dealing with all sorts of different forms of speech. You know, there was like heated rhetoric around the virus, opinion, comments, things that were really tricky to fact check, or things that were coming from anonymous or like just unknown sources. And so we really had to think of creative ways to address that information and think about new vehicles of delivering information. And so we focused a lot on transparency, pointing people to credible sources of information, explanatory journalism, and providing as much context as we could to some of the claims that we were seeing.
Thank you for that. Shana, I want to switch to you now. So you work both as a local journalist in Cleveland and also as a fellow research in misinformation for First Draft, which is a group that works with journalists to kind of explore and uncover trends in misinformation. So can you share just a little bit about both roles and how your reporting before the election was informed by your experience researching misinformation throughout the year?
Sure. So, as I came on board with First Draft, we began to assemble. Ironically, we assembled right before the lockdowns happened. So we all kind of gathered and never got to meet because we had to get out of the city, go back home, and then boom, we're in lockdown. And as we anticipated what we were going to do, we were focusing mainly on the census and focusing on the upcoming election in November. So we thought we had a little more runway to kind of get a handle on it. And it felt like once COVID happened, like just the gates burst of misinformation and it was everywhere. And so one of the things that we did at First Draft and then even with my own journalism was just trying to, for me, it was helping other people kind of fight the misinformation, disinformation fire. We knew that we couldn't do it just by myself. If I see something, like I can amplify it, but it really was about how do we get this information to the communities that are being impacted the quickest way. And if it's not via our platform, who needs to know it and to amplify it. And so that was kind of the approach of spending days just kind of going down the rabbit hole that many of us don't want to go through and go down on social media, seeing what's trending on every social media platform, realizing that there's still stuff in people's text messages and messengers, and really just trying to find out where the data voids were that misinformation was seeping in. So we would find out that, people were worried about food. And so there was misinformation about food. And so how do we give people the right information about food so that it can kind of stop the stories? And so that's kind of what we did in the beginning. And then as we got more into the election coverage, it was really about equipping people with what they need to know and making sure people felt safe even going to vote.
Thank you for that, Shana. Anjanette, then I want to switch to you. Given the context, both at the national and the local level, and the importance of Michigan this year, or the prominence of Michigan this year as well, how did the Detroit Free Press set out to address misinformation at the local level this year, or last year, excuse me?
Yeah, I mean, it still kind of feels like it's not ending in Michigan. We had quite a really long election season, but I mean, first of all, the most important thing is we started out the season with a grant from the American Press Institute, and that was really beneficial in us being able to do this work. We felt it was incredibly important, especially what happened in 2016, to be able to tell the full and complete story of Michigan's role in the presidential election in 2020. And so we have a very strong politics team, and we were ready for that. We also worked with PolitiFact to do some fact checking, and so we were ready on that front. But we felt there was a serious hole if we didn't cover misinformation, and it proved out. I mean, in the entire time we were doing this, we created essentially an always on microbeat essentially for the period of something like 6 weeks, and did nothing but election misinformation. And we're able to go really deep on it. And we saw things in that work that bubbled up, you know, in areas where we would not have known what we were seeing if we had not been looking for them online first. And so it was very important to inform not just the work we decided to do in misinformation coverage around the election, but just our broader coverage around the election in general. But it was intense. It still is. And I'm just so glad we were able to sum it up at the end of December. It's all running together.
Thank you. Nicolás, Documented has always kind of started from the premise of how can you direct your reporting to serve your audiences and your communities in New York City. How did that approach and that culture play a role in how you addressed misinformation last year?
Hello, thank you for having me. It's amazing. So we have never been so much of an organization that does misinformation coverage, but then at the same time we cover immigrant communities. So when the pandemic started in March last year, we launched a product on WhatsApp that basically is a newsletter on WhatsApp, but by WhatsApp being a messaging platform, we were getting a lot of messages back, and we started to get a lot of questions about things that we thought that we were seeing in the messages that were fake news, or that were like, fake news. And it's quite striking how within the Latino communities of New York, community that we cover, the fake news that we're spreading in Spanish are 100% different from what we were seeing being covered in English media. While the English media at the time was covering misinformation about QAnon and Bill Gates having to do with the vaccine, with the virus, and Trump and blah, 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 here within the community that we were covering, the misinformation had to do with like, take this chlorine, like magical cures for COVID, being like chlorine, being herbs, being find a herb in a Bible, and if you boiled it, if you put it in a water and then you boil it, it will cure you. That was one thing. And the other, like miracle cures. And the other one was fake like messages that were being distributed on social media with like fake aid in money. So because Latinos and immigrants and undocumented Latinos especially were very badly hit, especially undocumented. So they needed cash. And there were like fake news saying that the office of the president is now giving out cash. Click here, it would take you to like 100 like click through buttons until you get to have to give your personal information. These were the kind of the trends that we were getting from this community that of undocumented Latinos. It was quite different. The same with at the end of the year with the vaccines. We thought that there was going to be an issue there regarding like sharing your information with the government so you can get a vaccine. And we went to report it with the communities, and then the communities mostly responded that the main fear was how safe the vaccines were. and we got that these concerns were coming from fake news. On the vaccines they're like testing on us that we are poor. The vaccines are not being are not being taken by the rich because they're testing it in us first. Why were they made so quick? All of the concerns were not about like ICE, like we're gonna be deported because we take the vaccine. We're about safety, and the safety concerns came from fake news.
Thank you. I think that the understanding of what different audiences are hearing and seeing and how they're reacting is a really critical function of how misinformation spreads, and how we think about its impact just broadly. So following up on some of y'all's opening remarks, Shana, you talked about the kind of flood or firestorm of misinformation. How did you can you go a little bit deeper into how you responded that with your journalism, particularly around and before the election, and what did you learn from that experience in engaging with your audiences and communities in Cleveland that is going to shape your reporting moving forward?
Thanks. I think my approach was to inform the community of what was happening. And so before I joined the First Draft team, and as we got ready to begin the year, there was a lot of news about how the African American community was targeted with the 2016 election and misinformation. And for many of us, and what I knew about my readers we weren't familiar with the term. And so as I started seeing the term misinformation, so as I started seeing some of the items that came out that said this was a misinformation post or this was a misinformation post, I realized that those were things that I had seen in 2016, or maybe it came up in my Facebook memories of something I might have shared. And so realizing how we were impacted and didn't know it. And so that's what made it important to me. And realizing that as we were going into such an important election, plus the census, it was just, how do we stop kind of the hemorrhaging here? And so our approach was to teach people what it is, to start identifying it, and to start being able to kind of put out the small fires in their circle. So we all have that auntie or the older grandma or whoever that shares that thing on Facebook because they're trying to help, and they're not meaning to start anything or be the nefarious bad actor that we hear about. They're just trying to take care of us and warn us. And we need to be able to say, hey, grandma, like, don't stop, don't share that, or it's not true, or what have you. And so I really wanted to make sure that I equipped our folks with, here's things to look for. So that way there's more people fighting the fight of misinformation. And about the same time here in Cleveland, our legacy paper, the Cleveland Plain Dealer, started to go through a very obvious transition, and people weren't sure where to go for news. And about the same time, we have all these outlets sprouting up. Are they real? Are they not? So it was really just trying to get your voice heard over all the noise. And there was just 2020 seemed to be a very noisy year. And so the other thing I realized was that a lot of it was coming offline. And so we were, watching the Facebooks and the Reddits and the Twitters and the Instagrams and the YouTubes. And then just, going for a walk, because that was one of the few things we could do during COVID times. And I'm starting to see flyers on telephone poles. Hey, the Republicans are the ones that are going to keep you safe. Biden's going to deport your family. Biden is the one that's going to institute martial law. And it's a flyer. So how do we sound that alarm? And if I hadn't been walking in the neighborhood and those folks weren't following our coverage or what have you, would they have believed that? And so that was kind of the approach we took. And thank you to the grant of API with the election, so that we could kind of help people do explainers and help people know, kind of just to pause before you share. Are you getting that text that said, hey, my brother-in-law has a friend that works for the FBI and they're going to shut down your state and the army's coming? I would never know that you got that text, but I need you to know that if you get that text, or if you get some text like that, that you should probably not share it, look into it, ask a friend. And so that was kind of the approach we took, was how do we inform others to kind of help slow down the spread? So how do we flatten that curve, kind of was our approach here in Ohio.
Thank you for that. Anjanette, can you talk a little bit about the process that y'all took? One of the things that you wrote about that I found really interesting is how you looked at the provenance of misinformation across platforms, and then how that popped up in places that maybe if you hadn't been looking elsewhere, you wouldn't have seen it or known that context. So can you talk about what that process of searching and tracking kind of provenance of these claims and how that informed reporting about these issues?
Yeah, and that was something, I think as we were looking for how this misinformation reporting fit into what else we were doing with, like, say, with PolitiFact, where does this fit? We really thought it was important to be able to explain how this stuff moves, and kind of building on what Shana said, about being able to teach other people about what they're seeing and how they can look at it themselves. We thought if we focus on where this is coming from, how, that was a key word for us, provenance, but also networks. So how are these people and organizations maybe connected, if it's tightly connected or if it's even just loosely connected? We wanted to be able to, as much as we could, explain what was going on there. One of the pieces of misinformation we tracked down was there was this list of supposed dead voters in Michigan that was really floating around. And there were strong claims about, everybody's over 100 and there's no way they voted. And, it was really catching fire. And we saw that. And we were able to follow it back to, I believe it was a tweet, and it was somebody who said, made some joke about, like, I just dropped my vape or something like that. And I also put this list on Pastebin of people who are over 100 in the state of Michigan. No reference to voting or anything else. And pretty soon that information started getting shared around as a list of dead voters. So what was originally just haha, this joke sort of thing, and people over 100 in the state of Michigan on Pastebin became like this ultimate source of information for people who wanted to do their own fact checking. And that's what was one of the things I think that was most important that we focused on, was how people were not looking to us to tell them true or false, right? Because the people who were looking to us to tell them true or false were already our readers. And if we said that's true or that's not true, that wasn't going to be enough for them. They wanted to do their own work. And so they wanted to dig, and they wanted to take this list, like in the case of the dead voters, right? They wanted to take this list and find out, did they vote? And are they alive? That was another thing. They were convinced everybody was dead. And so they started cross-referencing that list against things like Find a Grave, right? Things that aren't even like where you think misinformation lives and you need to get experienced with it, but they were checking for graves, and finding somebody with that name and that relative birth date who was buried in the state of Minnesota now. And so they had to have been this dead voter from Michigan who's now buried in Minnesota. And they were using what little information was in that list to really validate their thoughts and theories about who was voting in the state of Michigan. And they're just, A, there wasn't enough information to go on. And B, I mean, we're all journalists. We know that that's not enough to verify what was happening. And in the case of one, and I love this story, we called someone on that list and she said, I'm alive, and we quoted her saying, I'm alive, and I voted. So it was, it's hard to track. It's hard to track when they jump from one platform to the next, when this information jumps. It's hard when it's not text and it's video. It's really hard to follow all of that information, but we did the best we could. And I think that the tools are getting better for doing those sorts of investigations too.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Nicolás, if we can, I want to dive a little bit deeper into the work that y'all did on WhatsApp, and specifically, I just want to think about the logistics of what you did. So, how did you get that WhatsApp group set up? How did you get folks to join? And what was the process or ask in order to get folks to kind of share, like, hey, we're seeing this. Is this true or not? And direct reporting around that.
Yeah. The WhatsApp, it's not a group. So the WhatsApp product was made from research that we did on Latino communities of New York. And we tried to understand what was missing from the current offer and what were the main concerns of this community. And the reason why it's not a group, it's because in the main concerns is privacy. And in the groups on WhatsApp, you can see the numbers of other people. So it could expose at the end of the day, people that don't want their information or their number, or you have like a photo, so you don't want, and we started this, and it was for a year, one direction, like a newsletter. But then when the pandemic happened, WhatsApp being a messaging platform, people started to ask. And then I joined Documented, and we made it very personal. I started every message saying, hey, it's Nico. Sometimes I share like events or things that I can share, like my picture. In fact, it's so personal that people send me birthday wishes when it's my birthday. And so it's being personal. And I think when it's personal and when you care about their concerns, for example, privacy, so we never ask for any information. Sometimes it's so when you care about what people are concerned, and when they know that it's a human being, you create trust, so we got to a point in which even people send us like their information papers that they're going to submit to USCIS, and they send us like screenshots, and I'm saying, and I would say, like, please delete this, because like you don't want this on anybody's computer. It has your address and you're undocumented, and you could be like, so I would say that the key is trust, but you cannot get trust just because you're a journalist, or we do journalism, because as my colleagues were saying before, we're under attack all the time. People have developed, and it was also spearheaded by the previous president, that we are not people that people should trust. But I guess that at the end of the day, we are human beings, and people trust human beings. So when we make it clear that it's us, people like you and me, working behind the screen that you're reading, and we're talking about the things that people are concerned about, we start to get this. We start to build trust. And then people would send us, hey, Nico, is this coupon from Jeff Bezos that is giving like $1,000 to undocumented people real? And I'm like, no, it's not. As another colleague said, please do not share it. But then when we analyze the trend, we're able to understand that these kind of coupons are being spread in messaging platforms in Latino communities. So then from there, we're able to create journalism and a story. But then in our case, it's a story made in Spanish for these communities saying, hey, watch out. These are all the coupons that are going around. Please do not share them. But it's also a story that in our case is sent to an English-speaking audience, that in terms of, but for Documented, it's like made of decision makers in the area of immigration. It's like lobbyists to the state Congress, community organizers, journalists, judges, lawyers. So they know that these things, and fake news is one of the things, but they know that this is happening in their organizations, in their community that they are at the end of the day serving.
Thank you for that. Just want to give a reminder to folks in the audience, if you have any questions, feel free to drop those in the chat, and we will get to those throughout the event. Karen, at the national level with Associated Press, you know, your opening comments, you talked about the variety of issues that misinformation and false claims crop up. So I'm curious, you know, what's your assessment or checklist in terms of how you decide, okay, here's what we're going to cover this issue, and here's how we make that decision, or perhaps to ask it another way, how do you make decisions about what not to cover and what not to pay attention to?
Well, I think, you know, in deciding, are we talking about claims that we're thinking about debunking, or, you know, how to address false claims? Yeah. It's a very interesting calculus for us. And I will say that it is like the one question we ask ourselves the most from the beginning of the day to the end of the day, and even afterward. But primarily when we're looking at debunking something or going after a false claim, you know, one of the first questions I'm asking is, you know, was this a claim that was made by a public figure? You know, somebody who, or, you know, somebody who's in the public sphere, somebody whose words carry weight with people, where they might listen to that person. You know, so I'm looking at that first. I'm also looking at, you know, whether this is a claim that just exists in the wild, or is it something that can be connected to some sort of larger narrative, some larger false narrative? And can we connect the dots into something that's bigger? So I'm looking at that as well. I'm also looking at, you know, this has been raised already, but when I'm looking at a claim, I'm really looking to see, like, has it cross-pollinated across social media platforms? And I think that was one of the biggest takeaways for me from 2020 was just, you know, we had spent a lot of time looking at Facebook and Twitter and YouTube. We really expanded that in 2020 to look at, you know, like TikTok and even Weibo and Telegram and Parler and Reddit and, you know, other forms, other social media platforms, just to kind of see, you know, what was being passed around there, what was being shared, what was gaining traction. So that became like a really good indicator for us. I also, you know, when we talk about, I think this point was raised by Shana, but offline misinformation, I paid very close attention to what was being said, you know, by my friends and my family members. What were the questions that people were just generally asking in conversation? And that too became a real indicator of, like, here's something that we need to address, right? Here's something that is top of mind for people. I say also, you know, one of the bigger considerations in deciding is this a claim or a comment that could lead somebody to take, you know, actions in their daily life that aren't great? You know, could it lead this person not to go to a voting station? Could it lead this person to ingest something that may not be good for their health? Could this cause harm? So that is also like a very big part of the decision that we have in choosing whether to debunk something. And then I try to see, you know, there's a lot of claims out there, all sorts of claims, and I really try to pay attention to the ones I think people could fall for or are falling for. So I look really closely at the comments behind some of the claims that, you know, that we see online. And then, you know, in 2020, I really looked at how claims were manifesting in different formats. So often it would be like a tweet, or, you know, there'd be like a text story, but then we'd see it in a photo, you know, pushing the same claim, or a video, whether it was like a short form or a long form video, or a meme. And so I tried to look at, like, you know, was this something that was taking on different formats? So it's so there are a lot of considerations in choosing, and we really do go through all of that line of questioning with everything we put out.
If I can add something before we move on, Andrew, you know, just listening to what, you know, everyone here is saying, I think the one thing that Nicolás said that really stuck with me is that it was for us here at Black Girl, and just even with the first draft space of representing all of Ohio, knowing the community. So misinformation just didn't exist for one community in the same way. So, you know, you think about Ohio, and we worked with a fellow in Michigan, we could see how the ripple of misinformation from Ohio hit Michigan, or like the militia that left Ohio to kidnap, that planned in Ohio to go kidnap Michigan's governor. We were constantly aware of that flow of misinformation across state lines and into neighboring communities. And it wasn't that it stopped geographically. So, you know, as we deal with immigrant populations, if they were dealing with something at one border, it wasn't just like, well, that's just the southern border and it's not a problem for family members other places. But what I wanted to say was, just even in that, you know, we really saw it with for us, the Black Lives Matter movement. And, while we were locked down, we were going through that, we were memes, we were all watching Tiger King. At least we still kind of had this safe community feel. But I think the summer just kind of blew up for us. And the community needed to know that we were with them. And so it was really pushing ourselves and our reporting to get out into the city. Maybe we didn't want to go to the protest because we knew that it had the opportunity of being dangerous, but we had to show that we were going down there, we were seeing what was happening, like we were there to be eyes for people, but also knowing that our reporting for our other audiences under the First Draft umbrella, or even some of our platforms that followed us, might have been for people that were just trying to still get a grip of what was happening. So we served different audiences and had to present in different ways. Our community of imams and people like myself worry, like, is my child in danger? Can I go outside? Am I going to be hurt by police? And then we had the higher level discussions of rallies out in neighboring communities, and how people came together, or how people didn't want the rallies in their community because they don't want that attention here. And so it was really about, as we look at misinformation, how it just kept twisting and turning in so many ways for one issue. Just as much as we had vaccine misinformation or lockdown misinformation, the reopened folks had their own misinformation. And it was not saying we're right, you're wrong, but just realizing that we were all just victims of, as Annette said, these tools that just keep getting better and better. And that, I think, was the biggest takeaway of it, was that we were all, no matter which side of this line you were on, were getting some kind of information that was changing how we acted and thought.
Yeah, and if I could add too onto that, that idea of listening in different communities and understanding not only what they were saying, but the word choice, I think is incredibly important in this line of work, because not only do people need to hear you addressing their concerns, right? But it also, because it's all online, it all ends up being a search term and something that you can use to turn your information into something that gets out there into those spaces, even if you don't know where those spaces are, because you're using the language of misinformation to get out in there in those communities. And I don't mean that you're spreading it, but you're careful about your word choice to address the things that they're talking about, and in the languages that they're speaking, and in the particular concerns of those communities. You're absolutely right, Shana.
So before, I just want to ask each of you one last question before we move into questions that the audience has. And I'm seeing some questions come in from the audience, so please drop those in the chat if you have those. But same question for each of you. There are folks in local newsrooms around the country that are at very different levels of sophistication and awareness around responding to mis and disinformation and other false claims. So what's one or maybe two things that you would tell that person, like, here's what your newsroom needs to be paying attention to, or here are the tools or approaches that you need to get comfortable with in order to respond to these claims that may be bubbling up in communities across the country. And so, Anjanette, I'll start with you. What's one or two things that you would say to that local news leader?
First thing I would say is take some time and just be in these groups and listen. If you're not there and you're not understanding what's happening around you, you're going to write a headline, you're going to cover something, that really ends up, instead of correcting the record, making things a lot worse. So I think that's something that everyone, regardless of what their beat is, I mean, if they don't have the resources to develop a full beat, fine, but you should know what you're hearing, and you should be there to hear it.
Shana, go with you. What's one or two things that you would tell that local news leader?
I think I would say kind of what Anjanette said. Number one, listen and realize the impact of your reporting. As journalists and reporters, we're so often taught to get the headline, break the news, be the person. but sometimes in our reporting, we can hurt the community we're trying to help. And so, just take a second and be mindful of that, just even thinking about the George Floyd video and showing that video over and over and over again. Like, I'm sure many of us remember the first time we saw it, but what is that doing to someone that looks like that person or might have known that person to see that go on over and over again? And so, we don't want to traumatize our audience. And then the other thing is realize that to continue to learn, misinformation is not stopping, it's not going away. It can show up in your local school board meeting or, neighbor disputes, and even in some of the apps that we think they don't show up, like our Nextdoor app or whatever, those, neighborhood little clusters. And so just, take some time to kind of get to know misinformation, disinformation. And, I think within that, if you're not sure where to start with serving, service journalism and just doing the explainers and telling people and unpacking it that way, I think is the safest way to tell the story, as opposed to like, we're going to take this bird's eye approach and too bad for this community, poor guys over there, because it really can hurt that community that you're trying to help.
Thank you for that. Karen, one or two things that you would suggest for newsroom leaders?
It's hard to follow that because those are just excellent suggestions. But I would say the one thing that I learned in 2020, and I mean, this is natural, I think, for all journalists, but to be just skeptical of everyone and everything. I think that, we might turn to certain public officials or elected officials at any level for what we think might be facts, and we need to question them as hard as we would anybody else. And I think that was a takeaway. And then I would also say, listen to yourself. Like if you're taking time to be in Facebook groups and looking across the digital landscape and you're having a reaction to something, don't ignore that. Listen, because if you're having an emotional reaction to something, there's probably something that's off. And one of the things that really benefited us in 2020 was just taking note of that as we went along, because we would notice something in February and it was just sort of an odd claim. And suddenly it would blow up. And in August, we were writing a full-blown piece on it. And so I would say, don't ignore that, take notes as you go. And then I would just emphasize what the others have said, because that was great advice.
Thank you. Nicolás, you cut out briefly, but the question for that I've asked everyone is, what are one or two tools or approaches or ideas that you would share with local news leaders who are maybe just kind of launching a focus on false information, misinformation, or trying to build out their capacity to cover these issues effectively? What advice would you offer them?
I think that what I would say is try to identify and know who the audience that you're trying to reach is. And after that, I would tell a news leader to listen first and then act, and to understand how we can contrast our bias as journalists and as educated people with a salary with the needs of the audience, whatever the audience is. So for example, for us, it's it's happened that a lot of times, I'm Latino, I'm from Chile, but the fact that I'm Latino does not mean that I'm not living the same than what an undocumented person in New York is living. I have education, I have salary, I have a visa, those are big differences. And I would say, try to identify the audience, try to talk to them and to listen so you can act based on what you learn from these conversations. Because then the conversations because then the content will make sense. And when you make sense, you become trustworthy, and then magic happens.
Thank you for that. Now I want to move into audience questions. Thank you all for posting questions in the chat. And I think some of these questions are not directed at anybody in particular, so if you want to jump in with a response, please do. But two questions that kind of look at the terminology, and I'll combine them so we can deal with them that way. First, what impact has the buzzword of fake news made on the connotation of misinformation? And then a useful corollary, what are the other examples of the quote unquote language of misinformation? So just thinking about the terminology and the impact that has. Anyone want to jump in with a response to that?
Well, I can just start on the fake news part of it because I think it's been totally misappropriated. And it's actually a term or phrase that we try to avoid at the AP because we have seen it be weaponized to refer to anything that somebody doesn't like. So we are really clear when we're discussing misinformation or explaining misinformation in the story. We really do try very hard to dissect it and to nail every single fact down that we can around it. So, and I think the term fake news we've seen be used around the world, right, by other world leaders. And we saw this a lot in 2020 and a lot in 2019. So, yeah, so it's not a term I'm fond of.
If I can add, I think, fake news really also comes from what side of the line you stand on with that. So there are communities that, yes, it's fake news. While it's hurt all of us, there are also communities that when you say fake news, people are like, oh, you're a supporter of that movement. So it's just one of those things that's really divided. But with most of the language, I think to the language example, we just have to look at our friendly hashtags. So, the words can sound positive, like, yes, I'd stand behind that. Like, what was it? The Save the Children rally. Most of us want to save our children, but that was a QAnon rally, or Stop the Steal. How many of us, either way, no matter how this election was going, we would have been like, yeah, stop the steal. We all want fair and accurate voting. However, the words fair and accurate were even contorted to say it's not fair or accurate. And so I think that's the interesting thing about this misinformation, disinformation piece. Even the word misinformation is a whole spectrum that we kind of lump in and crowd out. And it's this thought that, we just weaponize words, and that's really what's happening here. So, Black Lives Matter, Blue Lives Matter. Okay, well, yes, there are people that's weaponized for us now, for so many of us. That's the interesting thing about the whole thing, is that a lot of these hashtags that we're seeing, cancel culture is another one right now, where some people say it's cancel culture. Some people say it's holding people accountable. It really depends on where we are. And a lot of our divisive speech is, even the word divisive, a lot of that is wrapped in and seeded, it is seeding that misinformation that we're talking about here today.
A couple of things when we talk about specific language used in the election. There was this point overnight where people thought that a great number of people thought that Biden had stolen votes in the middle of the night. And it was being shared with this phrase, magic votes, if you remember that, Biden's magic votes. And it was being shared as a chart. And so we flipped that and we shared the correct chart and also called it Biden's magic votes, but put it in quotes and then explained what was going on. So we were using that same language. And more recently, we've been talking about, since Michigan is in another coronavirus surge right now, and worse than in the fall, the subject of Michigan shutting down has come up again. And that's been a very divisive term, especially politically, and it'll come up next year in the governor's race, right? And so we're very careful about how we phrase that, but we know people are talking about Michigan shutting down. And so our headline can be, here's why Michigan isn't shutting down. So we can use that same language, but just flip it and use it to explain what's really happening.
Thank you all for weighing in on that. This audience member asks, if I recall correctly, public trust in the media sits at about 40% or so. Did that inhibit your ability to combat misinformation? And do you have any success stories in building greater trust in the communities that you serve? Anybody want to jump in with a response to that to kick things off?
I think COVID also impacted us, not just necessarily public trust, but people weren't interacting with us the way they normally would have had they been going to the office every day. And just not even going to the office, we had a lot going on just dealing with COVID, as Americans in March and April. And so, it just was easier to not deal with news for some. We just were trying to be in survival mode. And so that really kind of put us behind the ball because it made it harder to get information out, especially during that time of the census. And when we shut down here in Ohio, it was, I think, about 3 days before our primary election. And if you recall or have heard, Ohio, we didn't know if we were having the primary on a given day. There were a lot of injunctions. No, we're voting. Yes, we're not voting. No, don't come out and vote. And so just information was really hard to get out to the people, let alone combating misinformation, because people just really started going to the social platforms and finding things that made them feel better. And so they didn't necessarily want to interact with news, because everything was coming to their phone. So I think it did. One of our success stories was, though, just we started using things that we were seeing that we knew like my family was sharing and putting that into the lead, like memes are misinformation. Have you seen this meme? Let me tell you how it hurts you. Or how it's hurting us, or do you see that? And so that was the way, because people were interacting with stuff that they're seeing as they scroll. Did you get that text from somebody saying that, the FBI is coming to downtown and gonna do whatever? Let us tell you that. And so we really just had to just kind of abandon some of the older practices that we know worked and really just do kind of quick inoculations to kind of combat the fire.
Any others with stories about how you work to build trust this year?
I think, it's hard to measure trust, I think. I don't know if this worked, but one of the things that we did at the AP was when there was all this sort of, at the beginning of the year, especially that first week of March, there was so much uncertainty and there were so many unknowns about the pandemic. And we just really felt we needed a way, some kind of vehicle to address what we were seeing that we couldn't exactly fact check, but there were questions that were coming up that were just rising to the surface that we felt a need. We've got to address this in some way. And so we started a series called Viral Questions, which are basically like 300 words written sort of to people, not at them, very comfortable language, very kind of long enough to explain a question, a commonly asked question, but short enough that you might remember it, paired with something that was an original illustration, so like a very catchy way in. And this was extremely popular for the AP in 2020 and continues to be. And we just, one of the takeaways from it was that we didn't have all the answers, but telling people that we didn't have all the answers was a good thing for us to do, right? We could say, we don't have a solid answer here, but here's what we can tell you, and point you to the CDC and point you to the World Health Organization. And it we really opened the door widely to everyone. So we continue to get a lot of submissions for questions, and that powers the series. And I hope that is building some trust, because we're being very transparent about what we know and what we don't know. And so I think I would count that as one of our success stories.
Can I add something to that?
I
think that what Karen is saying is just what we also do, and it's part of showing some humanity, that there's human beings that could not know but will report on it. And that's like departing from that idea of the media that knows it all, and that we are journalists that know all, and that we have to know everything. And it's even like even gets to a point that it's kind of like burdensome for us journalists. Like, I didn't know about that happened. And I mean, I've got the answer, like, are you not a journalist? And so when you show that people don't know about things but will report on something, I guess that it shows humanity. It shows that there is a human being. And I think that at the end of the day, that is building trust as well.
Awesome, thank you all.
I think though, one last point is there's no question it's made it harder. I think it's made it harder on the local level and the national level. It's a complicated place to be right now, and all the more reason to be as responsible as we can, and not to I forget who said it, but not to pull the trigger too quickly on a story if you're not certain and you're not ready.
Thank you all for that. We're nearing the end of our time, so I think maybe we'll end with this question. I think we've, or at least speaking for myself, I've seen a lot of reporters that focus on misinformation talk about the emotional and mental strain of doing this kind of research, and also the targeted harassment that it brings from the folks in some cases that are spreading the disinformation or propagating some of these narratives for whatever gain, political, financial, etc. So can you talk a little bit about how, if at all, your newsroom considers these issues, what you've seen, what you've done to support journalists that are and support yourselves in dealing with these issues?
Yeah, two things, and this was super important to us. The reporter who did all this work for us was Ashley Nurbavig. Before she came on board, she and I went over her social media accounts and set up, two-factor authentication, cleaned up anything that she was uncomfortable being out there. People are looking for, especially in this line of work, they're looking for your home address. They're looking for ways they can get at you and your family and make you uncomfortable doing this work. And so we started out with a lot of those security measures, and the Freedom of the Press Foundation was great at helping us get some of that going, especially last year. The other thing too, and shout out to Shana and her colleagues at First Draft. I mean, they were really instrumental in making sure we understood that to do this work, you need a safety net. And so there were points when Ashley was swimming in this stuff and it was hard to find her footing and really say, well, what's true and what's not at some points. And so she was able to reach out to me, and I was able to reach out to others, and just don't let somebody swim in this for too long by themselves.
I think I'll add, I think I would add, really make sure that folks are okay. So, we were all just going through 2020, and I know some of my colleagues, come January, after it was announced that, Biden hit 270, like it felt like there was a sigh of relief. And, like the holidays came and you just started really being able to feel, one of my colleagues said, like, it almost started, like all of it caught up. And, they kind of went into this like depression or space because, look at what we just lived through. And for us, we saw all the memes, I saw all the hate speech, and I read both sides, and, saw why people were so angry at Black Lives Matter and what they said about George Floyd. And like, just, you see it, you internalize it, you press on. And it was just really important to be able to have that space for, especially for me to be able to come back to like a First Draft, for me to just be like, I'm having a heavy day today. We saw this, we're seeing that, we're going through this, and it's not okay today. And just to be able to give room for people to know that they're doing this work, and, and it's work that many of us don't want to do. Or, if you're not into that space, you probably don't want to dig that deep into your comments. But it's, giving that person some space to just take care of themselves, because it can be scary and overwhelming, and, burnout is real, and we don't want that for great journalists.
I can totally echo that. I mean, I think, one of the things that was top of mind for me throughout 2020 and continues to be, and always is sort of the health and well-being of my reporters. And so I was doing this on all levels. I was having one-on-ones with them pretty much every day. We were talking as a group, as a team. And then the AP was also running a lot of sessions in which we could, bring in outside experts to really talk through a lot of what we were feeling, how we were experiencing things, especially through the summer. So that was just greatly, I mean, I was so grateful for that. I would encourage newsrooms to do that, and newsroom leaders to do that.
We are a very small organization. We only have 3 full-time staffers, and I'm the only one that speaks Spanish. So I'm the only one that manages the WhatsApp community, and the amount of things that you see every day, especially like in terms of like people asking for food at the beginning of the pandemic, then people asking for money to pay rent, people sending us footage of like the landlord trying to get them out. We've got people like from the Mexican side of the border saying that they're going to cross the desert, who they can reach on the other side. It's kind of strong for somebody. It's being hard on me, but I've received all the support from my 2 colleagues in Documented. I'm able to take time off, able to say I'm not feeling okay. And coming from a big media organization before Documented, I was an editor and news anchor on CNN Chile. It's the local TV station here in Chile. So big media tend to be super not personal, and the shifts kind of drive me crazy, etc. And I wish I had a caring boss like what Karen was saying in the AP, like somebody that will understand that people are humans, again, going back to that subject, and that you can are feeling under the weather one day. And I think that for us, people that work in the media, we tend to not work with like fun stuff, it's kind of like heavy for your inner self. So understand that, and understand that other people can be going through moments is something that we should all take as a standard in the industry.
Well, thank you all for ending on that vulnerable note and sharing what this work is like, and for the insight throughout the conversation. Really deeply appreciative of the knowledge that you all have and the work that you all do. And also want to thank the audience for spending some time with us today. I know I took us over 2 minutes, but thanks for bearing with us. And thank you to the News Leader Association for hosting this conversation and promoting it and getting us all here in the virtual room together. But with that, we will wrap up for the afternoon. We will send out the recording and some notes from the conversation when we have those available. But again, thank you all so much for joining, and have a good rest of your afternoon. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care.